All right. What is trust? What is empathy? What are the qualities of a well-functioning team? Are some of the things which we will talk about here. Trust. I was just telling this morning to my wife, saying that I had long back put down six values people should have and we should inculcate in our children. And the first of the six values I put down was this word trust. Okay, it's quite close to my heart. That's something we will talk about today. And this is where we are. We are in the 10th session out of 12. Um, so if you look at our program, what we did was in the first five sessions, we spent some time in terms of what is leadership, what does it take, what are the characteristic development of skills, and so on. And then we went into some of the core neuroscience concepts. And once we have grasped that, we came out and we said, how do we apply that practically to our own lives in terms of enriching our lives? And there were three, which was on self empowerment, which is finding our purpose, managing time, not so much in terms of scheduling and stuff like that. What is the big picture which we have when we say time management? What is stress? How is it caused? How do we reduce stress? All of that we have discussed. Now, there's not a lot of time as professionals we spend alone. A large part of our life gets spent in terms of various interactions. These interactions could be with our colleagues, these could be with our family, and these could be with society in general. We are a social animal, and there's a lot of interaction which happens. And therefore, how do we develop three important things when it comes to interpersonal relationship? How do we think critically and understand what is going on? The second one is what is this trust, empathy, and teamwork? And finally, we will talk about communication. To me, session number 10 and 11 are, in a sense, part one of two. And today we'll be doing the first part, and the second part will be done in 15 days' time. And finally, we'll wrap it up in terms of connecting all the dots. Now, we have seen this. We have seen this slide almost every single session. What is a flexible leader? We talked about cognitive flexibility, dispositional flexibility, and very, very importantly, emotional flexibility. In emotional flexibility is where we have things like trust, empathy, listening, and communication. Right? So that's the part we will focus on today. Now, let's take one step back and forget specifically about our professional life and go to a Harvard Business Review's longitudinal study. This was a study which was started in, I think, 1938, and they went and administered a certain questionnaire to 268 second year college students, sophomores. They administered to 268 people on various aspects about whether checking their vitals, checking their family backgrounds, and how happy they are, and so on. And they recorded all the data. A longitudinal study is one where the same 268 people will be given the same questionnaire 1 year later in 1939. And then it was administered in 1940, 1941, and 1942, all the way till date. In 2021, there are hardly 18 or 19 people who are still alive from the first batch of 268 people. They continue to run the longitudinal study. It is the world's longest longitudinal study ever administered. In the process of administering it, they have added more people. I think today they administered to something like 4,000 people. More people have been added. It started with 268 in the year 1938. Now, what they found was extremely eye-opening. Okay. They didn't really expect anything like this to come out when they started with the study, but what they found was extremely eye-opening. What did they find? What they found was really close relationship, much more than money or fame, led to happiness in people. Close relationship. The operating word here is close. These ties protect people from life's discontents even more. They are good predictors of happy lives even more than social class, our intelligence, our professional achievements, our social status, and even genes. One of the people who administered the study, who was a key part of administering the study, said when the study began, nobody really cared about empathy or attachment. Okay, they expected the results to be very different because they expected your eating habits, your workouts, and your sleep patterns, and so on, where the ones people believed will lead to greater happiness and greater health, and health being a strong contributor to happiness. They expected all of that to happen. Nobody really cared about empathy or attachment. But the key to healthy aging is what he calls as relationships. Okay. Now, what is this relationship? They have gone ahead and defined it a little bit more, and we have taken the liberty of paraphrasing some of those things and also adding a couple of our points, which is when we talk about long term meaningful relationship, we are not talking about Facebook friends. It's not the quantity of friends. It is not that every day we make a beautiful meal and put it out in Facebook and say that I'm now very happy. It's not the quantity, it is the quality of the relationships. It could just be a handful of people, it could be just 10 people, but it's a high quality relationship. What is this quality? We'll talk about it. One critical way to answer the question as to whether it is a long term or meaningful relationship or a relationship which is for a certain task is to ask the question, will this relationship truly continue even after the terms of this relationship, the terms of reference of this relationship ends? I'll explain what it means. I have a relationship with a colleague of mine. We get along very well. The reason we get along well is we happen to be the part of the same organization in the same team. We are working and sitting in the operating out of the same room. But once I leave that particular job, we don't know whether the relationship will continue or not. Because there was a reason for the relationship to exist because of the terms of reference and that particular thing which we had between us in terms of working in the same organization. But once I leave or he or she leaves that particular organization, our relationship might not carry on further. It happens with our school friends, it happens with a lot of other people. The third question is, how real are we in that relationship? Okay, we will know which are the parts when we are being a little different from what our natural self is. How much of our natural self are we in that relationship? It's a good test to find out whether we are in a meaningful relationship or not. Then the good old funeral study, will they be there for my funeral if I were to pass on? And most importantly, after a certain interaction with that particular person, how do I feel from an energy level point of view? From an energy level point of view, there are certain relationships which drain us. We interact for 10 minutes and we say, why the hell did I even start this conversation with this person? There are certain people where we talk and then our energy levels are lifted at the end of that particular interaction with that person. And it seems to happen every time we interact with that person. Then we can say we are in a long term and meaningful relationship. These are just 5 points. We can really create our own points in terms of whether we are in a long term, meaningful relationship. And to nurture them, to cultivate them is a key thing to long lasting happiness. A long term meaningful relationship doesn't mean that we don't fight, we don't bicker. Okay? It does not mean that we are happy with each other all the time, but definitely it is not convenience based. Definitely it is not with a certain purpose in our mind, saying, I will try and develop this relationship so that I can achieve that particular goal. As long as there is a certain goal which that relationship is a means towards a certain goal, it's very unlikely it is a long-term meaningful relationship. Now, one of the key key contributors to a long-term and meaningful relationship is trust. I would go to the extent of arguing, saying it is probably the most important thing. And if trust is not there, anything else being there in that relationship is of no consequence or no use. So, trust really is the foundation of relationships. What do we mean by trust? It's a very, very wide word. It can be defined in all kinds of ways. But the way we will define it is saying that it is that deeper intellectual and emotional connection. I'm sure some of you would have read Stephen Covey's book called The Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. Stephen Covey actually says that trust is the number one leadership competency. Our ability to trust is the number one leadership competency. Okay? He, in fact, says that there are many, many competencies which a leader has. But he has thought about saying, can I really single out one competency and says this is the most important? And he felt he can, and he believes that that competency is trust. The starting point of trust is ceding control. Okay. When we truly trust, when we have that connection, when we truly trust somebody in our team, when we truly trust somebody else, it is ceding control. I'm sure all of us would have gone through the situation where we have handed over the car steering wheel to somebody else. It's our car, we have handed over to somebody else, but we're sitting in the front seat and we are waiting to say something in terms of, turn like this or that, and, don't brake too hard, all of that. That is a very simple example of a lack of trust, not an example which is a big one or a powerful one, something which should worry us, but it's a small example in our ability to seek control. Once we have handed over something to somebody else, how does it make us feel in terms of saying, does it make us feel like it will get done? They will try and do it in the best possible manner they can. Or do we feel the necessity and the need to come and keep checking what is going on with that particular task which has been handed over to them? Therefore, trust really is an internal thing to begin with. Trust is what we show, it's a part of interpersonal relationship, but it has to start from within. It cannot exist where there is anxiety or insecurity. If we feel anxious about handing over something to somebody, if we feel anxious about trusting somebody, if we feel insecure, it is impossible to trust. We can say words like, I trust you. That's not trusting. Trusting is an action. Trusting is not a word. We don't say, I trust you. We just trust. People will feel it. Trusting works like that. It's a feeling, it's an action, it is in behavior, and people will feel when trust is handed over to them. And trust is the one which converts a bunch of individuals into teams, where our parents and management become our partners. Our teachers and our principal and our academic supervisors and everybody, all individuals become teams. Everything coalesces into an environment of trust and it becomes a very effective functioning team. Trust, by the way, is not some fuzzy, touchy, feely concept. It can be built. In fact, trust is an exceptionally good driver of efficiency. Let's take this example. Okay, I'm the head of a school. And if I believe that my teachers, if I'm not there, my teachers might not come on time, they will try and come late, they will go back early, they might not spend all the time teaching effectively in class, what are the things I do? I start off by having a register when they come into my school and ask them to sign that register. Second, we might say, what if they sign and mark a number which is different? Then we incur additional cost by saying that we'll keep a biometric which will log in as to when people are coming in. We will log in when people are going out. To find out whether they are teaching effectively or not, we will install CCTV cameras. We will monitor them. What are all these things? These are all elements of mistrust which we are adding to the cost layers. And not just cost, it is also things which we are adding in terms of our bureaucracy, in terms of unnecessary systems. If we were having trust in the first place, we won't be having any of this. So trust is not some touchy-feely thing. It is something where we truly cede control to somebody else with no anxiety and no fear after doing some proper critical thinking and evaluation and everything else. We don't want to trust before the person is ready to be trusted. That's not what we are talking about. But we truly seek control and then allow the person to do it themselves. Trust is highly empowering for the other person as well. And therefore, trust creates two things. One, it creates great efficiency in an organization. And two, it creates an atmosphere of really high quality shared values, which we have as a team. These are the two big upsides of a trust organization. All right. Trust also works at a societal level. There are big, long studies which have been made in terms of trust societies and societies which don't have high trust societies and low trust societies, but we won't go there in the interest of time. So, some characteristics of trust are these. One, if it's a trust based relationship, usually the talking is straight. If you disagree with somebody, just tell them, I disagree with what you are saying. We are not saying you are disagreeable. All we are saying is, I disagree with what you are saying here. If there is low trust, when we say I disagree, it can get construed as I don't disagree with you. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm disagreeing with the point you are raising. And that happens, people will focus on the point when we talk straight in a high trust environment. Two, trust is truly an action thing. It is not a word. We don't keep saying, I trust you. We just behave in a manner that is trusting towards the other person. So we have to truly demonstrate it. Third, we cannot have situations where there are some people and then we say just hold on, and then we go to the side and talk and all those kinds of things. The transparency in dealings have to be there. We cannot create cliques where in our organization we go and talk on a certain thing to somebody. I'm not saying everything has to have everybody in a meeting. I mean, that's poor time management, and more importantly, it's wastage of everybody else's time. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that we don't create things where we create forums which are outside of some of the more formal forums we have created to address issues as an organization. It has to be transparent, and transparency creates trust. In trust, if it's a trusting organization, we normally handle the point head on. Okay. If you're uncomfortable with a certain point, just get up and speak to that particular person. If you can't speak to that particular person, then at least write into that particular person so that we can enable a conversation around it. Right? And finally, accountability. Now, here is what my general disposition has been. This is the only point where I'm saying about from my experience. I have found it far more easy to first start with trust and then titrate to see whether the trust needs to be calibrated a bit in a certain situation. So the first card we deal, what we lead with is trust, and then try titrate later, rather than going through excessive cognition and critical thinking and all of that, and finally coming to a judgment or saying that now I will trust, it doesn't seem to work too well, and it's kind of a waste of time. So you can kind of lead with trust. Leading with trust, the only problem with that is there will be certain times when the trust which we have shown to somebody else will be misplaced or misused or abused, and therefore it might backfire. In which case, it's a risk we are taking. But that's fine. If you don't even take a risk, what the hell? I mean, we should take that much risk at least, I think. So there's no need to grant it way too early without even knowing anything about that person. But once granted, okay, so let us say you've taken a person, okay, and given them a certain task. You took a teacher, there were a bunch of teachers, you made somebody the head of primary or whatever it might be. From there onwards, you have to truly believe and trust that the person can deliver. You can provide some amount of help which is required for them to perform their job, but we cannot get down to every little detail and saying, "Yeah, I'll do it this way, I would have done it this way," and so on. It chokes the other person, and it also shows a lack of trust, which is not at all empowering to the person. We did critical thinking first, and then we are moving into trust for a reason, because critical thinking precedes trust. So, some amount of understanding of what is going on has to be there. If you just go ahead and blindly trust anything and everything and everybody, then it is not trust, it is called gullibility. Right? It is called gullibility, and that is really what it is if you trust way too early. Now, there are certain elements which
I'm
are
sorry,
key.
Ramesh, sir, to disturb you in between. Jharna over
Yes,
here. Good evening. Ramesh, sir, would you please elucidate a bit more the last point? Without critical thinking, trust is gullibility. Like, how
sure.
come critical thinking comes into the picture?
Correct. So we need to have an
Thank you.
yeah. Thanks, Jana. So we need to have some sense of So there's a difference between blind faith, okay, where we are not really even assessing the situation and just going and trusting somebody blindly. Okay, a simple thing could be a large number of these finance schemes which are there, which were out there just a few years back, where there are these schemes which come out and say that the rate of interest which we will get in a bank is 6 or 7%, and we will give you guaranteed returns of 20% or 25%. Okay. Now I can trust that. I mean, that's a very hard one. That's not an interpersonal relationship. I can either trust that or don't trust it. If I ask the follow up question and critically judge in terms of saying, how is somebody able to give you 20% return? You will realize that they are probably deploying capital in areas which are highly risky areas, and therefore the money is unlikely to come back. So that basic level of critical thinking has to be done before we can trust that particular financial transaction. It applies the same way when it comes to human interaction as well. That if I have worked with somebody for 2 to 3 years and I've seen a demonstrated competence, if there are enough evidences for me to say that this person is good enough to go and take on another role, then at that point in time I evaluate and I understand all of that and say I now trust the person to take up the next job or the next higher role, and I go about doing that. If I don't do the due diligence and just blindly trust and go and either stick some money in the finance scheme or go and give a responsibility to somebody else, then in which case the trust can get betrayed. That's not the big problem. The problem is we didn't even go and follow the right process before we granted trust. Okay, this is in an organizational situation. In a personal situation, my general disposition has always been trust most of the people before you need to titrate that particular relationship. Yeah. Now, there are some things which are required for us to be trusting and to be able to receive trust. One of them is empathy, and the second one is authenticity. I sent that little video by Francis Frey a few days back. I hope all of you got a chance to take a look at it, where she talks about the ALE model: authenticity, logic, and empathy. We've already spoken about logic in critical thinking, authenticity, and empathy. Now, I've said it many times in this brief 20 minutes. Trust without authenticity and empathy is hollow, because trust is more an action. Trust is not a word, it's an action. And without empathy, without us being ourselves, it looks very hollow. And one of the things humans are exceptionally good is picking up hypocrisy and hollowness. All right. So if something is hollow, something is hypocritic, it's very, very easy for people to pick it up. Okay. And we don't even need words to pick it up. It can be smelt out just like that. We can enter an organization and say very quickly whether it is a low trust environment or a high trust environment. We will feel it. You can enter a shop and immediately know whether the salespeople are being treated properly by the management in terms of their salary, in terms of the perquisites and everything else. And you can enter another restaurant and say, why does it feel very different here? That's the difference between the two organizations. Is one is a high trust organization and one is a low trust organization. Now those two words, empathy and authenticity. What is empathy? Empathy is not an action word. All right. Empathy is not compassion. We want to draw the line between empathy and compassion. Empathy is simply our ability to step into the shoes of another person, to be able to see from their perspective, to be able to see things from where they are seeing it, because they have a very different social, economic, educational, cultural background. And we have to put ourselves in their shoes and see it from their perspective, and then use that understanding to guide our action. Now, that action is something else. That's not empathy. So, that action is an act of compassion. It could be an act of whatever else. I mean, there are many different ways in which you can branch out. Empathy is simply our ability to put ourselves in the shoes of the other person and to be able to see from their perspective, which will be able to guide our action. A couple of things which we should not do in empathy. One, what we should do, and one, we should not be doing. First, we should feel empathy. Very often, more often than not, we have a tendency to say, I understand. We rarely do. We can't. Okay. I can only imagine is the appropriate usage, where we just simply feel the empathy. When we are feeling it from the other person's perspective, it normally doesn't involve words. So try not to talk when somebody is pouring their heart out. Try not to talk or interrupt. The second, which is a big temptation, is to relate to another story, a parallel story, in trying to put some structure to what they are saying. We don't need, because the other person really doesn't need that to be able to relate to another story, either from our life or from somebody else's life or some other story. And most definitely, don't try and solve the problem. Empathy is a feeling where we are just relating and going through, using our mind and going through their mind to see what is that they are going through. All right. If you try and do any of these things, which is talking and asking questions when somebody is saying something, asking questions. Or the second one is trying to relate to another story. You know what, this happened in this particular situation as well. No. And the third one is, I'll tell you, I've gone through something similar to this and I know how to handle this. Not at all. Don't go there at all. Okay. Just feel it, because all the other things end up hijacking the situation. Let's take another thing in terms of listening. What is empathetic listening? Let's say there is a child, okay, my daughter, all of 10 years old, and she comes running back from school. There was a field trip on that particular day, and she comes enthusiastically and wants to talk about her field trip. Okay. Now I'll add some more data. Normally she comes back from school at 4 o'clock. After the field trip, she is back from school at 7:30, and there is a homework and a submission which has to happen the next day. All right. And her time to go to bed is 8:30. Now, how do we respond when she comes inside our house enthusiastically and wants to relate a certain story? Now, there are four different ways in which we respond. These four ways are called active destructive, active constructive, passive destructive, and passive constructive. What are these? Let's go through a small example of, or use that example and say what might be our response. Each one of us can relate to it, I'm sure. One of the types of responses is where we say, okay, the field trip is already done. It's taken so much time. Now let's get down to the homework because we have a submission coming up tomorrow. All right. That is called active destructive response. It actively destroys that person's enthusiasm. Okay. That is not empathetic listening. That's the exact opposite of empathetic listening. The second one, which is a little more common, I hope you're not doing the first one, a little more common is where we are focused on some other activity and we just say, okay. So something of that nature is what we go through. We are distracted. We are thinking about something else or doing something else. Now that's passive destructive. But most of us do what is called passive constructive. Very often we do this, which is say, oh, wow, you had such a good trip. I'm so happy that you had a wonderful field trip. And then we immediately relate it to something else. You know what? This is what happened the last time you went. And then all of that starts off. That ends up hijacking the story. It is not destructive, it is definitely constructive, but it is just premature and it gets aborted, the enthusiasm. The right response when it comes to empathetic listening is making them relive their experience. Just make them relive the experience. If nothing else in this 30 minutes, just take this one sentence back. Whenever somebody wants to share something enthusiastically, allow them, figure out a way by which you can make them relive that experience, which is just tell them, tell me what happened. I want to listen to all of it from the beginning. I want to listen to every bit of what happened from the beginning. And that is active constructive. So, active constructive is taking genuine interest and you give it an opportunity to amplify the experience, right? The passive constructive is what a lot of us engage in, which is we give the support, but the conversation stalls, it gets aborted at some point in time. That's as far as empathy is concerned. Now we'll move to authenticity. This is a quote I love. I heard it for a long back. Oscar Wilde, apparently it's said by Oscar Wilde. It's not very clear whether he said it or not. Be yourself, everybody else is already taken. Authenticity is much easier said than done. It's a much used word and very difficult to practice. A simple test we can put ourselves through is how do we behave in various situations? How do we behave with our spouse? How do we behave when the management comes in and talks to us? How do we behave with our children? How do we behave with a taxi driver? How do we behave with our maid? How do we behave with people of different structures? Or when we are invited to some place to give a talk, how do we behave? How many different eyes are there? If we have many, many, many eyes, there is always some amount of calibration we have to do to interact with a certain amount of person. But if that is going to change the eye, and there are multiple versions of eye which is floating out there, that is a not authentic way of conducting ourselves. Okay, so we have to have a sense of self belief and a courage to be ourselves in most situations. Of course, there will be some amount of calibration. We won't be talking or saying and discussing the same things with everybody. That is different. But we are generally, if I were to go and ask, describe this person to 20 of your relationships, and all 20 describe it very differently as to who you are, chances are that we are putting up a front and a show, and that's a very difficult thing to manage, and it doesn't create trust in people because people don't know who you are. People don't know your true self. People would much rather know that you are like this, which they don't like and appreciate too much, but at least they know what I see is what I get. We say that all the time. What I see is what I get. Okay. In other cases where it comes out very hypocritical, which is something to guard against, but authenticity is fairly straightforward to practice, which is just be yourself. That's it. Don't second guess, don't judge, don't be fearful, all of those things, because they all lose authenticity. Just be yourself. That's all that is there to authenticity. Now, how do we connect all of this to a team? So, whenever we use the word team, normally what we mean is a bunch of people. That's not a team. That is a group of people. That's not a team. That's not a team at all. It is not a group of individuals. Teams are ones, okay, which is able to deliver an output which is greater than the sum of its parts. The example I use all the time is the New Zealand cricket team. You will rarely find anybody who's outstanding in that cricket team, but they seem to come to the semifinals in every single World Cup. Okay, the sum of the parts is so the whole is much greater than the sum of the parts. Now that is a good functioning team. Teams have as their foundation, okay, they have very strong shared values, a set of values, a set of beliefs they share. All of them share those values, and they display great mutual trust. There is no second guessing of intent. There is no backbiting. There is no bickering. There is no back channel talking. If you're uncomfortable with something, just talk to the person. Just say, this happened, but I'm not so sure that I liked it so much. It's fine. It's particularly difficult because we are all brought up in a society where we are told that we have to be respectful of seniors, respectful of elders, respectful. But what kind of respect? We need to have genuine respect. It doesn't mean that we suspend every single critical thinking faculty and just blindly support and everything else. That is jingoism. That is not trust. That is not faith. That is not even good behavior. It's just jingoism. In a good functioning team, people pick each other up. In a bad functioning team, the exact opposite happens, which is blame game. When you see in your organization, there's a lot of things where we are able to all point fingers in different directions as to whose problem it is. That is a bad functioning team. I'm sorry, I have my dog screaming there, but I have only one more point, then I can go on mute. No, I'm going to go on mute, and I don't have a door which I can close, unfortunately. One second. I'm sorry about that. Yeah. So, in a good functioning team, people lift each other up when the chips are down. In a team which has mistrust, which has poor shared values, there's a lot of gossiping, there's a lot of back channel talking, there's a lot of suspicion on intent, there's a lot of second guessing, there's a lot of insecurity. And people in good functioning teams are just themselves. You will find them in a social setting, you will find them in the professional setting, you'll find them in all other settings. They will simply seem and feel the same to you, no matter what it is, depending on whatever topic you're talking, it doesn't matter, they will be like that. Good functioning teams will always feel like you're just having some fun, right? So now, here is one thing. When we spoke about critical thinking, we said one of the ways to reclaim our critical thinking is to be skeptical, which is the will to doubt. Now, when we are talking about trust, we are saying lead with a trust card. Now, how do we reconcile the two? Can we both be skeptical and trusting? Can we both be skeptical and be trusting? Now, here is my take, my view is generally people are well meaning. Most people are well meaning. Okay. In most interactions, most cultures, most societies, people are well meaning. So I would generally say trust people, lead with a trust card and trust people wholeheartedly. But we are prone to errors in cognition. The human mind, we tend to over credit it because as a peer group, we unfortunately don't have somebody else to look up to. We are the most intelligent animal. Somebody else is to look up to. We will probably grow our ability to think, but we don't have anybody else to look up to. The human mind is prone to a lot of errors in cognition. So the general disposition I try to take is I trust people but doubt ideas. Views, ideas, opinions, hypotheses, put it through a rigorous test. But always trust people, lead with a trust card. When we doubt ideas, we are not doubting the person, we are trusting the person, but we doubt the idea. There's nothing personal here. Yeah. All right. Thank you. We'll move into discussions. I can